It is Neon Liberalism. It's episode 12. My name's Jason Brigham. I'm an associate editor for Liberal Currents. With me, as always, is another associate editor of Liberal Currents. That's Samantha Hancock-Lee. We're joined today by the eminent economist and returning guest to Neon Liberalism, Maia Mindel. And today we're going to be talking about tariffs, the favored source of tax revenue or foreign aggression of Donald Trump, the new president of the United States, once and now again. There has already been a tariff-related blow-up with the nation of Colombia in the few short days that President Trump has been back in power. And he's rattling the saber at other countries, such as, of course, Canada and Mexico, because it makes so much sense to slap tariffs on Canada and Mexico, the longtime mainstay trade partners and immediate neighbors of the United States. So, Samantha, how are you today?
Great. Everything's great.
Yeah, everything's great.
Yeah, I haven't been following the news at all. I
Mm,
assume nothing important is happening in
mm,
Washington.
mm.
Anyways, no, I mean, so I think it's interesting. There's been a lot of hay made lately about the chaos of the Trump administration, these plans to remake the federal civil service, and tariffs, like you say, keep on showing up in the chaos. They are Trump's go-to threat against foreign nations so far. He's tied them into a lot of his domestic policy, and they really weren't on the agenda before he came onto the scene. So I thought maybe we should talk today a little bit about like tariffs and like what are they and how do people think they work and how do they actually work? What do they actually do to a national economy, to global trade? So I guess we should start by talking about like, well, what is tariff?
Yeah, so I feel like the way people think about tariffs is that so if you put a 10% tariff on apples, what happens is countries that are selling you apples pay a tax on the sale. But that isn't really how it works because if another country started taxing me, I would just not pay them. I mean, what can they do about it? So the way that trade generally works is that you usually have to tell the government what you are buying in another country, generally for registration purposes, also because they need to know that all the products that you're bringing are, legal in the country, etc. And for example, the US has pretty strict import controls on sunscreens, which means that a lot of sunscreen that is available in other countries isn't in the US. And then, like, when you bring back the imports after you've told the government what you're bringing and whatever, that's when you pay a tariff. So the tariff isn't really paid for by other countries, it's paid for by importers from your own country, which means that usually they're foreign companies, but they pay it like in the country. But obviously, like, the imports are, you don't go to the port of New York or whatever to buy imported products. You buy them at the brand store. So if you say there's going to be a 10% tariff and everyone who buys the product has to pay 10% more, they're just going to charge you 10% more.
Yeah, they're not going to bring it into the country and pay the tax if they don't think they're going to be able to get away with raising the price, right? So
Yeah.
either they're going to bring less into the country, or raise the prices, or probably some combination of both.
Yeah, so Trump and company have talked a lot about tariffs as a way of raising money for the United States, right? There's talk about what do they call like the External Revenue Service is this phrase that's getting bandied around, but it doesn't really seem like foreign countries don't pay tariffs, right? Americans pay tariffs and they pay it to the government. Um, so we're not really looking at a tax on foreign countries, we're looking at a tax on Americans. One thing I do kind of want to ask you is why have tariffs I mean, right, historically, a lot of states have turned to tariffs as sources of revenue. Why is that? Why did they used to be a really popular form of taxation? Why did they kind of fade away? Is there some kind of history here we should know about?
Yeah, well, basically, first you have to look at, the basics of trade, which is what they call comparative advantage. So basically, it means that if you have two products, traditionally it's wool and wine, and it's Spain and England. If England is better at producing wool and if Spain is better at producing wine, then it makes sense that they wouldn't produce both. They would produce only one and trade with each other because then they, produce more of both products in total. But even if Spain was still superior to England on both products, then you would still, it wouldn't be like equally superior on both. One of them would still be better than the other. And so it would make more sense for Spain to specialize in one of the products and for England to specialize on the other. But when you get so there are gains from trade for countries and for consumers who buy the products that are traded. And so like back in the past, what they thought was that they didn't really believe in this. They Basically, they believed that the purpose of trade was to accumulate precious metals, gold and silver. And, the way to ensure that that you have the most metals is to get as much of them in as possible, so exports, and that as few of them as possible leave, which is imports. So the world had much higher tariffs. And here's the thing, when your trade partners have really high tariffs, it's not really economically convenient for you to have low tariffs because then you're putting yourself in a position where you have less of a comparative advantage on any product that has an unreciprocated tariff. So what happens there is that because in the past tariffs were much higher, it made sense for for each individual country to have their own tariffs be higher. So it's kind of like a prisoner's dilemma where like the ideal world is one where everyone uh, where nobody has any tariffs. So that's like because of all of these gains. But because like but if countries start like unilaterally tariffing everyone else, then like the economics don't work out in their favor.
Yeah, so I want to go back to something you said there about mercantilism, right? About the idea
Yeah.
that the point of trade was to accumulate gold and silver, what gets called specie, and to kind of highlight how tariffs, were kind of an artifact of an era of very low state capacity, right? That if you were the King of England way back in the day and you're sitting in your big castle, how do you raise revenue? How do you get the money to pay your soldiers? Which is like very important. You really want to be able to pay the guys with the swords. Otherwise, you're going to be in trouble. You need a lot of gold to do that. And you don't really have the bureaucratic weight to like go out and make sure every single person in the entire country tells you how much money they make, and then they give you over a small share of it, like we do with income taxes today. But rather, sorry, Jason, yeah, you want to jump in here?
And I'm going to say, and way back when, the kind of long ago era you're talking about, just the use of money was a lot less. A lot of people, people are producing and they're consuming a large share of their consumption is something that has been produced in their immediate area. Maybe they're directly involved because it's on their farm or something. Taxation was often in kind, and it was the taxes paid to the local lord or something. So if you think about the king, trying to get money, how do you get money out of an economy where a whole lot of what goes on in the economy is not money based, and the solution is to tax trade that's going on at greater distances, right? And
Yeah, that's
because
right.
that sort of trade is involving money, there are merchants and traders and whatnot, so they used to tax internal trade at a distance too, because that was where the money was. You set up a tax for people going down a river or something, because the people going down the river are the people engaged in trade that involves buying and selling, and that way that's the places you can like get your money, right? So but the same logic applies to your international trade, right?
Yeah, that's right. We're talking about economies that are not highly money based. And so where do you go to raise money? You go where the money is. Preferably you go to like choke points where you can make sure people can't really get away from the tax collector. So a river or a port is a good example of that. And so what you do is you levy a tariff, and that's how you raise money for yourself, the king.
Yeah.
But this is not like this kind of makes it clear the way that tariffs, they're not used to raise money from other countries. They're used to raise money from your own country. And so this is kind of the classic story about like what tariffs used to be and what they were for. Um, it's not the only reason people have turned to tariffs, though. And famous American founding father Alexander Hamilton makes this other argument for tariffs, what he calls the infant industries argument. And he says, well, look, we're America, we're a really new country. Over there, there's England, they're a very old country. They're better at everything than we are. And so if we just buy from them very cheaply, we'll never be able to establish new industries in our country. So we need to have tariffs to make English goods more expensive to encourage more American industries. And I feel like, Maya, you probably have something to say about the history of that style of argument.
Yeah, I mean that's well in Latin America that's a much bigger, that's a much bigger issue because the infant industry policies were and in some cases still are in effect fairly recently. Most countries didn't really abandon their big trade protection system until at least the 80s or 90s. So the history there is basically that, as Samantha said, for a really long time, the conventional wisdom in the economics of development was that countries needed to transform and industrialize. And that, because competition with established industrial powers was so difficult, because, you needed to make the same thing that was getting made in the US or in Japan or in Germany, but like with more efficiency because they had all the know-how there. You needed to first like set up your own internal market so your companies would be properly developed, and then you would be able to compete in the international arena basically. So like the reality is that this didn't really work. I mean, in Latin America isn't an industrial powerhouse despite the pretty substantial trade restrictions that most, if not all, countries imposed for most, if not all, of the 20th century. Well, first of all, some of this is because, like, basically during World War One, but especially after World War Two, it just became much less economically convenient to be closed off to trade because other countries stopped being closed off to trade. So most countries, it was because of like international coordination efforts, they decided to open up trade between them. It was called the Global Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, or GATT, for sure. So that meant that like one of the bigger obstacles, which was that the other country might not be very receptive to your imports, that went away. And so I feel like the second reason why Latin American industrialization didn't succeed, it was kind of goes against like the fact that Asia, especially countries like South Korea and Taiwan, had really similar policies that did succeed. So it was like a big debate well, it still is in a
Yeah,
way.
it still is.
The development, yeah, the development were like what exactly went right or wrong, and it's usually like back in the day, like in the 80s, it was kind of chalked up to institutions and state capacity, because for a number of historical reasons that are fairly complicated and I'm not too familiarized with, Asian countries had substantially higher state capacity and a substantially more educated workforce than Latin America, at similar income levels, let's say. So that meant that they had like a more competent and responsive state. And they also had like different cultural attitudes that made the government less able to flake on their commitments to companies.
So do you think that those institutional slash cultural arguments are correct, or is there a different story about why the so-called Asian tigers were able to industrialize in this period in a way that Latin America did not.
Well, I think that there is some degree of correctness there. Like I do think that the South Asian governments actually being able to carry out these programs effectively and efficiently was a major part of why they succeeded. Because, if you have like a big industrial policy strategy and then like you just aren't good at carrying it out, it's probably not going to work. So, but of course that means that it has to be like a good strategy. And I feel like if you go back to the comparative advantage point of wool and wine, you have kind of the issue where at least I personally think the problems started, which is that like, well, why is one country better at producing one thing than another in terms of costs, right? Uh, and it has to do with the available factors of production. So you can say, well, the natural resources and the land are better, and a lot of that has to do with labor and with capital, of course, like how much factories and buildings and equipment they have, and with how much labor they have, and whether or not it's skilled workers or not, and especially relative to each other. So if you have a lot of capital but very little labor, which is the case of Japan, you are going to end up with factories that are very automated and that use labor as sparingly as possible because it's a little more expensive. And if you have a lot of land and very little labor, you're probably gonna do animal agriculture instead of plants because it takes a lot less labor, which is kind of what happens in a lot of Latin America. But because in the 20th century, there are two like big things that everyone wanted to specialize in were basically building either consumer goods, especially textiles and automobiles and appliances, or heavy industry, steel, oil, big vehicles, stuff like that. In the case of the first kind, which is light industry, it takes a lot of labor relative to the amount of capital. And while Asia did and does have a lot of labor, because the countries are very densely populated and they're usually fairly small, Latin America does not. And the second kind, it requires a lot of capital because you need big machines, big factories, a lot of equipment. And for fairly complicated historical reasons, Latin America was not very good at accumulating that capital, and Asia was not. And I think that the quality of institutions is a big determinant of whether anyone is going to want to spend in today's money billions and billions on a factory like that.
Yeah, with politics, you always have, there's always going to be a story about how the policy is actually good for the country. And then there's going to be like whether that is in fact the actual reasons that the policy is being carried out. Right. And in the case of tariffs, we can tell a story about infant industries and how, oh, you could carry out tariff policy in a way that'll benefit the country economically. But you can also carry out tariff policy to just enrich people. It's a wonderful tool for a corrupt government to raise revenue through tariffs rather than broad-based taxes, right? Because tariffs are something you can target. Apparently the way that we allow the president to impose tariffs, that power is apparently remarkably concentrated in the president right now to impose, tariffs of apparently whatever level of targeting the president wants to, and that's an unbelievable source of power. If you're raising revenues from broad-based income taxes that are set by Congress, that is not something that the president can like wield as a carrot or a stick to get their way in whatever they want, right? And so, you can use tariffs to put particular businesses out of business. You can use it to help particular industries that your friends run, and if that's, I think sometimes maybe that's going to be obviously a factor in what governments are really up to. While, of course, they will say publicly, like, this is import substitution or whatever. This is the infant industries,
Yeah, of
Yeah, so I
course.
think that's right. There's a perspective on tariffs and global trade that I really like from Michael Pettis, articulates it in his book, The Great Rebalancing, and more recently in Trade Wars Are Class Wars. But his argument is basically that we should see tariffs first and foremost as a transfer of income inside of a country. A tariff in general, he argues, right, even a completely universal tariff, we're just going to tariff every single thing that comes into the country, is fundamentally a transfer from net importers to net exporters. And what does that mean in practice? Well, the household sector is always going to be net importers because you are not producing things in your household that you're selling abroad, but you are buying stuff that's made in other countries. So you're the net importer in this story. And who's the net exporter? That's businesses and industry that actually do sell things on the world market. Right. So any tariff at all is going to be a transfer from households to businesses. And like you say, if you start to really get targeted about it, it can be transfers that get much more specific in terms of which businesses or which industries or which sectors they benefit.
Yeah, so one of the reasons that tariffs were started being abandoned in the 80s is precisely this, that the governments of developing countries in particular, but in general, don't really have the capacity to avoid them being turned into, this instrument for systematic corruption. So what you end up having is something that the people of liberal currents love talking about, which is rent seeking. So you end up having, basically the industry saying, I don't want to compete with foreign companies. I want to charge higher prices, usually for a product that isn't competitive on quality either. Or that's like the argument being made, right? And so, they kind of collude with the government to restrict competition and to keep also in part to protect employment and that sort of thing. And like the factors of production issue that I've mentioned, that's also important to the inequality story because, if you have different types of labor and different types of capital, and their ownership is like especially concentrated. So, in the US, ownership of capital is very concentrated and labor income is also very concentrated. You end up having is like a social makeup that is very, unsuited for people to want to participate in international trade.
Yeah, so I think this ties back to some of these earlier questions about Latin American industrialization versus East Asian industrialization, because one of Pettis's basic points here is that on a very large scale, tariffs are going to function pretty similarly to other forms of national income transfer from households to businesses. Two of his big examples are currency manipulation, where the central bank works very hard to ensure that the country's currency is weak, which means that imports are expensive, but exports are highly favored. And this is functionally, right, it happens through the mechanism not of direct taxes or anything that's quite so tangible, but through complicated foreign exchange markets. But the net effect is to transfer money from the nation's households to the nation's businesses. He argues that a similar thing happens through what he calls financial repression, which is where the government essentially has control over the financial system, the banks. And they say, well, to take a completely random example, if you're Chinese, we're not really going to let you take your money out of China, right? You're going to have to invest it in a Chinese bank. And we're going to regulate the interest rates on your deposits so that you're always going to get a very low, sometimes even below inflation interest rate on your deposits. And what that means is the banks can turn around and make very cheap loans to businesses, right? They can make the cost of capital extremely low. And this, again, it doesn't appear like it doesn't show up at the end of the day like a tax does at the end of the year where you're like, oh, I have to pay the government this amount of money. But on a very broad scale, it functions as a transfer from households to businesses. And Pettis's argument is basically that the East Asian tigers, that's what is it? It's South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and I can't remember if it's Japan or China, or China is one of the new, I don't know, whatever, those countries, the
No,
various
because
East Asian.
Japan was a very early industrializer, right? With tariffs and protections and infant industry.
Yeah.
It's famously one of the countries that is an example of like why tariffs work.
Yeah. So Pettis's argument is basically that these East Asian countries were doing the same kind of thing in terms of, you know, trying to develop their own industries, but they pursued, you know, the so-called export focus industrialization policy, where instead of protecting your company from, you know, foreign goods, you're going to say, no, no, we absolutely want to engage with the world market. We want to sell to other countries. And this imposes a kind of discipline, like you actually need to produce something that people want to buy, like at a reasonable quality and a reasonable price, but you're backstopped by the government in these more ephemeral ways. And it just seems like historically that this does work better than the tariffs route.
Yeah, something I would like to note is that the big reason why there's sort of a disagreement between whether or not this, like, what makes these strategies work, is that a lot of these policies were also implemented in Latin America. They called import substitution industrialization, and it didn't work. Financial repression, for example, a big part of it was that investing, like the government was very unreliable and very, trigger happy with nationalizations and taxes and regulatory changes and breaking up companies and consolidating them. So people didn't really want to invest in the actual economy with these cheap loans because maybe like the government will just wipe out the company you invested in and give you basically nothing. So instead they invested either in government debt, which is that's a very modern Argentinian issue where the government just forces everyone to loan money to it, or in real estate and stuff like that, which is not very economically productive. Well, not very economically productive in the sense that like you're not gonna develop by building a lot of housing. It's as sadly as the urbanism people would like that to be true. But yeah, and the export discipline issue is, I think, again an issue of government reliability because the government was ultimately the one that had to enforce, export quotas and whether or not like and quality controls and stuff like that. And if you have a country that's weak and that has a very, easily corruptible state, you're not going to be able to actually enforce like an aggressive regime of export discipline. What you're going to end up having is even more cronyism and favors being doled out, basically.
So the Samantha, the thesis from Pettis that you talk about, that tariffs effectively carry out a transfer from households to businesses. I mean, it very much is of a piece, in the pre-capitalist, mercantilist period of history. High tariffs was just the unchallenged standard government policy everywhere. And this is part of the story as well. We talked about just the difficulty for the central government to obtain money. We talked about the idea there was an ideology of mercantilism that there was like a literal belief that holding a bunch of precious metals made your country rich. There was also just a view that domestic production was the most important thing, right? And so if you look at what separates mercantilism from capitalism, I always teach my classes that it's basically two things, one of which is the guilds and the restriction of new businesses, the limitations on domestic competition, and the other one is tariffs, and it's the limitation on foreign competition. And what those policies have in common is they support the interest of the established domestic producers, right? So that stability and big business at home needs to be strong, that mentality is like, and so you can see why tariffs were just such this unchallenged, like universal, like government policy in the pre-capitalist days, right? Like all these multiple factors or arguments or beliefs all fed into holding them up, and And but then as part of the whole revolution or whatever you want to call it toward capitalism, the tariffs came tumbling down a lot along with a lot of the rest of that stuff.
Yeah,
And
that's
now we have a world of trade, openness, or at least we might.
If we can keep
Yeah, we
it.
might be losing it.
if we can keep it. That's the interesting thing for me, right? We've all lived through many decades of a kind of a free trade consensus, right? Like you talked about at the start of this episode, Maya, that comparative advantage, low barriers to trade across nations makes everybody richer. That we all produce the stuff that we're good at producing and we sell it to each other, and we're all making more stuff and consuming more stuff. And that consensus really seems to be under strain these days, right? There's an increasing amount of dissatisfaction with that picture of the world, and a dissatisfaction that's increasingly bipartisan, right? Trump is the one who reintroduced tariffs to the national conversation, but in a lot of ways, Biden kept Trump era tariffs on Chinese goods, right? And the sense that we ought to be doing something, or that something is wrong and we want to change something about it, seems to be increasingly in the air these days. I have my own theory about this, which is, again, I'm borrowing it from Pettis, where Pettis argues that functionally the reason China is the workshop of the world, right? An enormously outsized share of global industry, and right, that's just a fact. And the question is why? Right. And well, China will tell you, well, it's just we're better at it, right? We are way better at doing industry and creating new products on mass scale and more cheaply than anybody else is. So, well, naturally, we're becoming more industrial. Um, and Pettis's argument is that this kind of comparative advantage should never lead to a durable trade surplus, right? If you're great at making anything, whatever it is, some widget, you're the best in the world at making that widget, and no one else can make it at the same scale or at the same price as you can, and you make all the widgets in the world and you sell widgets to everybody, but what do you do with all the money you make from selling widgets? You turn around and buy more stuff, right? That's the whole point, is that you buy more stuff that other people make, right? You buy the wool from England and the wine from Spain, right? And so your trade balance should, over the long run, come out to be relatively neutral. But a persistent trade surplus, the way that most of the world's major industrial countries have been running, like China, but also like Germany, also like South Korea, also to some extent like Japan, that kind of persistent trade surplus is a result of these kinds of domestic transfers, right? Of the deliberate suppression of consumption in your country and the transfer to industry, right? A subsidy, whether through the form of currency manipulation or financial repression or direct transfers or, overinvestment in infrastructure, many different ways you can affect these transfers, right? So that you don't consume as much. So you're not turning that new profit into imports, you're just turning it into more subsidies for industry and shipping it abroad.
Yeah, instead of your consumers buying foreign goods, it's your businesses investing in foreign countries, is basically the idea, right?
Yeah, like, and if you look at Germany and China specifically, which are the two countries that are the most invested in this, all investment, no consumption model of growth, what you end up having is like, eventually you end up having an excessive amount of investment and especially government investment. China has a lot of government investment that's just kind of pointless. And if consumer spending doesn't really increase in line with the productive capacity of the economy, what you end up with is a pretty prolonged and pretty painful recession, right? Because consumers don't have any money, and businesses can't sell anything to them. And Germany does this to suppress wages so that German industry remains competitive with China and Japan and all the other countries that are competing with it. China does it for very complicated reasons that I'm not really clear about. But like Additionally, I think that if you look at the balance of payments as a whole and not just trade, the balance of payments has basically three components: the current account, the capital account, and the financial account. The current account is, transactions. So obviously, the trade of goods, which is more what we've been talking about, the trade of services. So, like call centers, professional services, stuff like that. And also things that are like wages, interest payments, and so payments to people and companies, and also stuff like remittances. The capital account is very weird and doesn't really include anything that happens too often. And the financial account is loans and investments. And, you know, uh, basically this has to add up to either the growth or the reduction in international reserves of a country. The US doesn't have international reserves because it's money, like it raises its own money. So they have to add up to zero. And so, the only way to balance a current account deficit, assuming that like all the other stuff is balanced in it, is to have a financial account surplus. And the way to have financial account surplus is to attract investment to the country. And that can be done with either a weaker currency, Samantha has said. Obviously, you can have like a sort of to be really attractive to investment. That's another option, but that's really hard. So we're doing easy to have a weaker currency or to have higher interest rates, because capital chases interest rates. So if you want to have like a positive balance of payments and to have money like flowing into your economy, so to speak, you end up needing to push interest rates upwards, which obviously, first of all, has a different impacts across the income distribution, but also it and across different, factors, like the people who get their income from different factors of production. It also has a macroeconomic impact, which is that investment is more expensive, but also that consumption is lower because the labor market is depressed. So yeah, I mean let's have balanced trade, which the US is pretty rare among the industrial powers to have like a pretty large trade deficit. Is that the other side of that is to have like a more consumer friendly macroeconomic makeup.
Yeah, so I think you described this mostly as a process occurring domestically. Like if you want to affect your balance of payments, you need to change around your interest rates or whatever. But the point, right, is that you're always embedded in a larger world system, right? And if other countries are pursuing one of these policies where they're engaged in consumption suppression, they have an enormous excess of cash, right, their accounts need to balance as well. Where does all that cash go? It goes somewhere else, right? So that these aren't merely driven by domestic forces, but driven by the domestic policies in other countries that start affecting international flows of capital. Is that right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, obviously, once again, uh, if you have a trade deficit with another country, then the other country has a surplus. And if you have a trade deficit with the world, then that means like that money that dollars are going out of you and going to the world. So obviously the macroeconomic and trade policies of other countries matter, especially, in the sense that if other countries stop being open to trade, especially to trade with you, then it becomes less convenient for you to be open to trade with them. So, if you have a major trading center start roughing up its trade partners, basically, then what you're going to end up having is a bunch of other countries that have to retaliate for basic economics, right? And so a bunch of other countries that weren't initially, in this sort of thief, let's say, have to get drawn in, and which obviously has like, first of all, it does redistribute income from basically from labor to capital.
Maya, I listen to you and I think, you and I have this economics training and it's all built into this long-standing expectation of a public spirited government that has some
Yeah,
that has some of the basic problems solved and is going on to try to take up more difficult problems. And so we have all this like training teaching us these subtle, these explanations that are detailed and subtle and whatever to like figure out how to successfully encourage infant industries or to rebalance capital flows or something. And now we seem to now have a government that is extremely private spirited, not public spirited. And this new Trump administration doesn't know or care, in my view, about actually encouraging industries of this or that this or that, or balancing capital flows. Even if they thought that sounded good, they wouldn't have the slightest understanding of how to go about doing it. And what we're seeing in the beginning of the administration is just tariffs as a straight up weapon. Like I'm going to put tariffs on Denmark because I want to seize the coast of Greenland so that Milton Friedman's kid can build a libertarian utopia there. I mean that's the level of what's going on, right? Just tariff as a pure hurt the other guy. Like literally, it's like the equivalent of a cannon or something. I mean that seems to be the level of analysis on which the Trump administration is proceeding. And I got to say, you can only do that sort of thing if you're a really large country. If you're a really large country, which the United States is, you can play around with slapping tariffs on imports because international trade is only 15% of the total trade of the United States, right? So you can take a risk on provoking a trade war with some other country like Denmark that only sells a tiny fraction of the things that Americans buy. You won't make many Americans mad when you provoke that trade war because not many people are buying things from Denmark. And meanwhile, a much larger fraction of the population of Denmark would be hurt. And so the politics of it might actually lead the foreign countries' leaders to cave. This seems to be a popular verb these days for what goes on, right? But I just don't think this can really work. I mean, Trump seems to think that this is just some sort of magic weapon, but it's going to work occasionally. I mean, I just sketched out a scenario where it can work, but what tariffs basically amount to is if you're thinking of them as purely a weapon, I mean, then what you're threatening is it's a refusal to buy some of what the other country had been selling to us. And feel like in most cases that's probably only a short-term problem for the other country at most, because why can't they just find other countries to buy what they're selling? We refuse to buy what you're selling. Well, you can just sell it to somebody else for the most part, unless they're providing a specialized product for specialized buyers that are only found in the United States. But, if US leaders were to try to target exactly that kind of situation and say, oh, it'll hurt them most if we slap a tariff on things that they can only sell to specialized buyers in the United States. Well, guess who will get really mad in the United States about that tariff? The specialized buyers of that product that they're trying to get from that particular country, right? So you're probably going to run into a huge political backlash in that situation, which is the kind of thing that you were kind of hoping that tariffs were going to avoid in the first place. So you think like you're going to swing around this power as a big country and you're going to be able to get away with it because you won't hurt many people in your own country, but you end up having to target these really specialized trading relationships to really hurt the other country, and then you end up hurting powerful people in your country and they get mad at you too.
yeah. I mean, I feel like the biggest example of such a product is in the fight with Denmark itself. It's Ozempic. It's made by a Danish, well, it's not a company, it's a non-profit called Novo Nordisk, and the US is probably the largest global buyer of Ozempic. I mean, I'm spitballing there, but it's probably true because it seems way more
It's probably
pervasive in the US than in other countries. I heard somewhere that it was 15% of Americans who were on it. And so they say, well, I mean, we're gonna put tariffs on Denmark, and Denmark is like, well, and suddenly you have 15% of Americans that rely on a medication, and they're gonna have to pay more, or they're not gonna get it because Denmark just gets so mad that
yeah, great
they
example.
sell to someone else. And so, like, obviously, most countries that have done this, I should note, that have substituted their own uh, other countries' imports with exports weren't actually democracies. And at least in Latin America, most of them weren't, and in Asia, most of them weren't either. And a lot of there was like a very shortly lived fad. Well, it was shortly lived in like 2002. Now it's like most global politics to think that because Asian countries were not, were not democracies, they didn't really have to boost the incomes of all the treatlers, as they say on social media. They didn't have to give people any treats, and instead they could focus on boosting industry. Yeah, quote unquote. But like it also meant that they didn't really have, any clear gauges as to whether or not like they also didn't have any incentives for their policies to be good or to have good impacts, right? So you're sort of in a scenario where the tariff issue and the, trade reindustrialization issue, it's not really on the left's agenda.
So I want to jump in here actually and come back to that question about industrialization and the role of tariffs in promoting industry or these various other kinds of consumption suppression and promoting industry. I see kind of a deeper connection here with mercantilism, precisely because of the connection with war. Right, that mercantilism, you wanted a big pile of gold in your treasury so you could pay your army, so you needed to get the gold, you over the gold. Okay. Um, why are countries today interested in promoting industry at the expense of the welfare of their own citizens? It's war, again, because we live in an era where you don't need gold to pay your soldiers, you need steel to build the tanks and whatever, all the kinds of complicated composites that go into modern planes and the enormous material costs of modern war. And where does that come from? It comes from industry. And I think that more than anything is why we're seeing tariffs return to the conversation, right? And not just as the corrupt rantings of one guy, but why they're being embraced by politicians across the political spectrum, right? Or why something like industrial policy, right? For example, right, under Biden, we spent an enormous amount of money through the Inflation Reduction Act, through the CHIPS Act, various other kinds of industrial policies that are, again, functionally a transfer from American households to American businesses, right? Because we want to have that kind of industry in our country. And why do we want to have it? Well, they call it de-risking, right? Because we are worried
Yeah.
about the risk of war with the world's workshop, namely China, right? Because China has explicitly pursued a policy of consumption suppression, industrialization, and is increasingly using the power that gives them to rattle the saber, right, against all of their neighbors. So to me, I think this is kind of a more complicated issue than you're making it out to be, Jason, right? In the sense that there are these deeper forces that are driving developed countries like the United States towards various kinds of industrial policies. Although it's also true that I don't think, I mean, this gets back to what Maya has been talking about in terms of implementation in Latin America, right? Is that you can't, it's not just like there's a big button you push that says industrial policy and you push it and it works, right? When your people who are doing it are corrupt or incompetent or ideologically motivated because they hate woke and DEI and they're issuing these weird executive orders that are like defunding air traffic controllers and planes are falling out of the sky, right? If these are the people who are implementing our industrial policy, I don't think it's really going to work out quite so well.
There are good national security reasons to have certain restrictions on international trade, but I'd put an emphasis on the word certain in that sentence. If you need a certain supply chain to be super reliable, then okay, take the limited actions you need to bring that supply chain in. If you need access to just absolutely vital minerals. I mean, how much is that a reality? Maybe occasionally. Okay, but if it's an occasional reality, do the occasional things you need to make sure you have your supply of minerals to the extent you have genuine, like, actual prospects of and fears of these conflicts, right? But the slapping of tariffs on Denmark doesn't have anything to do with any of
No,
this. I'm sorry to say.
absolutely
Yeah,
not.
it's
No,
pretty
tariffs on
funny.
Denmark, tariffs on Canada, Mexico are
Yeah,
totally
and
irrelevant.
those are the things that have been proposed.
Yes.
So we could have there could be some regime of tariffs that is actually aimed at national security that would make sense, and I agree with that. But it that goes on the pile with there could be some set of tariffs that would actually encourage infant industries. There could be some set of tariffs that would like remedy capital imbalances or something. Those are not the tariffs that are being proposed. We don't have a government that is that serious, I don't think.
Yeah, I would like to bring up two things. The first, that de-risking as a whole, I think became. I mean, I'm not really tuned into the national security world, but the moment I started seeing it like on pretty mainstream economics talk was in 2020 and 2021, so after the pandemic, when you had massive disruptions to global trade, because you had countries that weren't open, countries that were reopening. You had a lot of demand for things, so a lot of demand for TVs and pedalons and spec clothing and stuff like that. So then you had like, and because of the lockdowns and because of reopenings and because of stuff like there was an earthquake in Taiwan at one point, you had big issues uh, with global production. So a lot of countries, what they wanted to do was they wanted to relocate trade routes either to their own territory. So you had stuff like Biden promoting cheap manufacturing in the US because a lot of problems with the electronics industry and also with cars and stuff like that were from not having enough microchips. And also to more friendly countries that weren't going to be under they wouldn't have like their policies dictated by China, because what happened was China had a much more extensive lockdown than most other countries. It lasted until well into 2022. Uh, and I feel like you can also kind of take a guess at why they're trying to bring industry back. When you see like what they're talking about when they talk about the industry, because they're not talking about heavy industry. I mean, this kind of like it's all over the place. But if you look at like the current government of the US and the type of person that is on it, you're not seeing them talking about big machines and all these massive robots and rigs and stuff like that. That's all operated by by little guys in glasses and top to bottom hazmat suits because they can't even get a speck of dust in the machines. They're talking about muscular guys in overalls pushing big machines around. So I feel like, I mean, I don't want to be like the person who says that everything is about gender, but it's kind of about gender too, because manufacturing was like the big employer of men, and it was well, in my other episode here we talked about how like a lot of like the economic supremacy of men, besides from property ownership, came from being the ones who went out and worked when the economy is industrialized in the factories. So they kind of like want to take the
No,
US back there
I
too.
think that's exactly right, and kind of a depressing note to end on.
Yeah.
In that, we're living in a world of increasing geopolitical tension, a world in which people are moving away for various reasons from this free trade consensus that had some problems, but objectively made a lot of us very prosperous, and towards a world of beggar thy neighbor tariff policies. And perhaps, I mean, even more strongly, tariffs implemented by people who aren't interested in any of that, right? But who are just see it as a weapon they can swing at our own allies, or that they can use to institute their vision of gender politics, or even just to prop up their particular cronies' industries in this country. So, yeah, the economics is one thing, the politics is something very different.
Yeah, the economics like the economics case for tariffs is usually to use them like a scalpel, so like to trim around a certain import or a certain supply chain that's, not very efficient, or it's like uh, hurting the national interest in some way. And the way that these people are talking about tariffs is like a sledgehammer.
Yes, that's exactly right. Not a world of scalpels, but a world of sledgehammers taken to the foundations of things. And however that shakes out, we here at Neon Liberalism will be around to try and provide maybe a more comprehensive perspective on the things that are happening in our world. As ever, Neon Liberalism and our parent publication, Liberal Currents, are listener, viewer, subscriber supported publications. So if you like what we do here and you want to support us, go on over to patreon.com/liberalcurrents. Sign up. You can join our Discord and talk to all of us, after hours about tariffs and gender and whatever else happens to be happening. Thank you and signing off.